This is Manhattan Insights, a Manhattan Institute production. I'm your host, Raihan Salam. Not long ago, the school choice debate was mostly about whether low-income students trapped in failing public district schools should have the option to attend public charter schools. But that's changing. Over the past year, 4 states have passed Universal Education Savings Account Plans, or ESAs, which allow all public school eligible families, regardless of income, to use public funds to cover a much wider array of options, ranging from private school tuition to online learning programs aimed at homeschoolers. Other states may follow the lead of Arizona, Iowa, Florida, and Utah, but each will have to confront unique obstacles to make their ESA programs a success. And political roadblocks have emerged in some surprising locales, including Wyoming and Oklahoma, where ESA opponents have carried the day. To make ESAs available to families, then, political leaders will need to navigate tricky terrain, and civil society will have to step up to help those who may lack resources or know-how take advantage. Jenny Clark is the founder and executive director of Love Your School. She's an Arizona mother of 5 who has worked tirelessly to expand educational freedom in her state and to help parents understand what is available to them. She joins us today to discuss her efforts to deliver new educational options for families across Arizona and across the country. Jenny, let's start with your story. You became involved personally in the school choice movement after navigating the educational landscape for your own kids, whom you were homeschooling at the time. Can you tell us a bit about that experience and how it wound up shaking out?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was a homeschooling mom and started homeschooling probably way too early, as most homeschooling parents do. Around 4 or 5, we started doing kind of some home education and curriculum. And through the years, I found out that my 2 oldest boys were really struggling to read. No matter what I did, no matter what curriculum I tried, there was just something there. And I learned that I could go get a private evaluation through the public school district, even as a homeschool parent. And that's something that is available in all states under federal child fine laws. And through that process, the district told me, you know what, it's just you as a homeschool mom, you're just not doing a good job. You're not educating your kids. But I knew how hard I had tried and everything that we had done. And I said, no, I disagree. We ended up getting a private evaluation at the school district expense. And it turns out that my 6 and 8-year-old at the time actually had severe dyslexia and dysgraphia, which impacts the handwriting. So it wasn't just me as a homeschooling mom. There actually was a learning disability there for my kiddos.
Wow. What was the original impetus for homeschooling?
Very, very interesting. So I was a public school kid. I went to public school, kindergarten through 12th grade.
In Arizona, right?
In Arizona, yes. And went to public college here and enjoyed those experiences. Never, ever thought that I would end up homeschooling my kids. But as I got married and started to be around other young families, I started to notice that I was really drawn to these families and these kids that were homeschooling. I started to really appreciate their family interactions, the knowledge and the rapport of the kids that were homeschooled. And that just really kind of opened the door for my husband and I to really start thinking, hey, is this something that we might want to do, even though we both went to public school, for our kids once they were old enough? And it was really the model of other homeschool kids that drew us into the idea.
Arizona is a somewhat unusual state in that Arizona has been a real trailblazer when it comes to embracing charter schools and also to earlier forms of ESAs. So as I understand it, several years ago, your family applied for an empowerment scholarship that used to be a bit more constrained. Can you tell us a little bit about that initial program and kind of what brought you to it and how your family used it?
Absolutely. So early on, Arizona's ESA program, which has been around for 11 years and is now universal, it used to only be for a different set of qualifying categories. It started where you could qualify for the program if your child essentially qualified for special education services, so had a learning disability or some other diagnosis, and you had the paperwork from the school district to show that that was indeed the case. Over the years, Arizona did add additional categories, such as if your child was, you were a military child, you were coming from a D or F rated public school, you qualified for the ESA, and a few other different categories. That meant that, of course, the program was pretty small and fairly restricted. It also was kind of restricting in that a parent might have, let's say, a private diagnosis of autism, but in order to actually get onto the ESA program, they would have to go through the public school system process and get the public school to agree and provide paperwork in order to get on the ESA program. So
were school districts resistant in some cases?
Yes.
Did they not want to provide that certification because they feared that students would exit the system?
It was a well-known kind of thing in Arizona among the special needs community that if you were going to go through that process and you were thinking about getting on an empowerment scholarship, you didn't really want to say at the district level that you were thinking about an ESA because of, different obstructionist type behaviors that might happen at the district level. And specifically the families with a diagnosis of autism, they're the ones that experienced that the most.
Fascinating. So if you didn't say you were interested in an ESA, they might be more receptive because I assume there would be more state and federal resources that become available to the district, right?
Yes, that's correct. So the Empowerment Scholarship Account Program in Arizona is very unique because it's based on a state funding formula. It's 90% of what the state's allocation is. So that means a neurotypical child, their ESA award is around $7,000 per year. But a child with a diagnosis of autism is looking at more like $30,000 per year, and that's only 90%. So you can imagine that what a lot of families were arguing that they were experiencing is they knew that the public school system was receiving a significant amount of money to educate their child, but they often felt like the dollars that they knew were going there were not matching the services their child was receiving, meaning that they could do more with less dollars going on an ESA.
Can you tell us more about that? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on families of kids with learning challenges, their experiences in the mainstream public school system. Is it your experience that a lot of families have found those offerings lackluster?
Yes, that is the experience. And one of the reasons why, and I didn't know this until I went through this process, and our nonprofit does exactly this. We help families know what their rights are and help them navigate that process. The public school system is required to abide by FAPE, a free and appropriate public education. The key word there is appropriate. So whereas you as a parent might, see your child and see all their challenges, but then also their unique abilities and really feel like you want them to get, say, a unique therapy, like executive functioning therapy for their autism. The school district can disagree with that and say, we're not required to give the best or even go above and beyond. We're required to provide the services through the IEP that allow the child to access their education. So what's appropriate? And so that challenge is where so many families felt like, their child deserved more, but the school district wasn't really obligated to provide more in many cases, which is why so many families got excited about and started moving to the ESA and the special needs community.
How did that diagnosis change things for your family? Once you actually had a better sense, here's the obstacle, here's what we're up against, and now you have these resources through the ESA. Did that lead you to change your tactics? Did that lead you to embrace different programs that you now had access to?
Yes, it changed everything. It is why I am such a passionate advocate for educational evaluations. It's also why I get frustrated when I hear stories of families that come to us where they've brought up concerns, but they've never actually gotten an evaluation for their child because maybe the school district has said they're fine or let's wait out or give it another year. My answer is always no. If you suspect something, you need to say something and you need to push for an evaluation. I mean, we can diagnose autism now at 2. It's absolutely remarkable what all these different agencies are doing to help early diagnosis of many learning disabilities, therefore providing earlier intervention. And so there's just a lot of freedom that comes from having an actual diagnosis so that you as the parent know that one, it's not you, it's not your parenting, and it's not your fault, but also having answers opens up an amazing toolbox of resources, of support, of encouragement. When I got the dyslexia diagnosis for our 2 boys, it was, you go through emotions where you're kind of sad about it, but then you're relieved. You're like, oh my gosh, okay, now I know why this curriculum, and this curriculum weren't working. They weren't designed for a dyslexic child's brain. And so I'm a big fan of getting evaluations and getting a diagnosis.
You run an organization called Love Your School. You're also someone with a lot of commitments, a lot of obligations. What is it that inspired you to go into the advocacy business?
It was my own experience. It was realizing how difficult the process was for me to go through with the school district to get an evaluation, to press in on that, to advocate for myself and my kids. When you're sitting in an IEP meeting, you and probably your spouse, and there are 7 other people around the table, and they're all saying everything's fine. We don't see an issue here. The problem is really you. It's really hard to push back on that. And I always thought I was the only one until doing my regular old mom life, going to the park and going to the museums and playgrounds. I would talk to other parents who were either wanting to go through that process or had been through that process. And there was kind of this joke of like, oh yeah, you never make it through this process without, crying in a meeting, no matter how tough you are. And I was like, I'm a tough mom. And I too, I cried in the meeting, and in the lobby of the school district throughout that process. And I felt like I was a very, resilient and hardworking individual. And if I was finding myself crying in a meeting and not having the support, I knew that other parents needed the support that I'd wished I'd had.
What exactly does Love Your School do? How is it you work? I'm curious about the kind of core tenets of your approach.
Absolutely. So we operate in kind of 4 key areas. 1, we help families find the education option that works best for their child. So we call that our school search consulting. We do that K through 12th grade. We also help families that are looking for educational evaluations, which can start at age 3. So we help them know their rights, navigate that process, and really get answers for what might be, an area of struggle for their child, the educational evaluations. We also help families launch new school options. So if they're looking to launch a micro school, start a cottage school or a co-op, even if they're thinking about, something bigger like a charter school or a private school, we help them see that they can do that and the steps that they need to essentially take for that. And then we also help families that are looking to transition to homeschool. A lot of families pre and obviously post-pandemic are deciding to home educate their children. And maybe that's outside of their normal, faith community or just even friend community to homeschool. So we help them realize that it's possible. We walk them through the process. We help them select curriculum and really make that transition to homeschooling easier for them.
Have you guys helped facilitate connections among homeschooling families so that they can pool their resources?
Yes, absolutely. So we did that ourselves. We actually had a cottage school in our home pre-COVID and for 2.5 years. And it was really a great experience for me so that I can understand what that process looks like. But we basically drew in other families that had similar interests and goals and a vision for the curriculum as we did. And we kind of all came together and just said, okay, who's going to teach what subjects? What is that going to look like? So at Love Your School, we kind of want to be that encouragement and that clearinghouse. If we find out, for example, that there's a family in the West Valley that really loves the idea of a STEM micro school, or maybe they want to do a classical Christian education, we can help connect those families together so that they're not doing it alone if they want to be connected.
Give us a bit of a history. So there's one version of the empowerment scholarship that you were able to access and that families of students with learning challenges or who are otherwise attending failing schools, that was one slice of the population. And now, before leaving office, Governor Doug Ducey signed the country's first universal ESA legislation, which greatly expanded the range of parents eligible for the program. I'm curious, though that program is still quite new, if you've already seen any impact.
Yes, we have already seen amazing impact. We had only around 12,000 account holders utilizing an ESA pre-universal. I just double-checked the number this morning, and we're now at 51,849 accounts. So basically, since the fall, since around September, when the universal ESA bill went into effect, we've added 40,000 new students to the program, which is just remarkable and incredible. And what that did is not only, provided finances for families to be able to either home educate with an ESA or finally utilize a private school. It basically signaled to the rest of the country and to education entrepreneurs in Arizona that if you want to do something innovative and unique when it comes to children and their education, you need to be in Arizona. So we've seen new micro school companies launch in Arizona like KaiPod and Primer. We've got more kind of on the horizon that we're recruiting out to Arizona. We've seen teachers and other parents go, now that there's a universal ESA, my dream of finally launching a cottage school or a tutoring company or a STEM educational delivery box company can be a reality because now families have the dollars to cultivate a customized education for their child. So we're seeing all sorts of new vendors, schools, and startups just even since September.
So just to be clear about the numbers here, you were talking about 50,000 students who are now enrolled, who now have access to these ESAs. And my understanding is that Arizona has about 1.1 million public school eligible children. So that's pretty close to 5%. And that's only with the program having been in place for a quite short amount of time.
Yes, the program is growing and we expect it to continue to grow. One thing I will say, though, is that there are so many families who love their public schools and who are very happy and satisfied with their public schools. Of course, when I say public in Arizona, I'm referring to district schools and charter schools. We have over 100,000 families that are in the charter school movement. But the program is growing, especially as the supply of new education options is increasing. And one thing that's really important to know, both in Arizona and nationally, is that public school enrollment has already been on the decline, both in Arizona and elsewhere. So we've already seen parents deciding to do something different for their child's education, and they were doing that pre-universal ESA. Now they finally have the opportunity to utilize those dollars that are there for their child's education to craft out an education that works for their child. So we've seen a public school enrollment dip, and then we've seen, of course, the ESA program start to increase.
So as I understand it, your philosophy and the philosophy of Love Your School isn't ESAs are the right solution for every family. Your approach is we really want you to love, be engaged with your school, to really feel as though it reflects your values and sensibilities. And that could mean any number of things. It could mean a charter, could mean a district school, could mean an ESA. But you see this as a great tool to help those families that have been kind of a square peg in a round hole.
Absolutely. At Love Your School, we say this all the time, that we are agnostic when it comes to a parent's choice. We actively work with families who have children that are special needs, but they want to continue in the public school system. We help them know their rights, and they're like, I don't want to get on an ESA. I want to make it work here at this public school. It's close to my home. I like the teachers. I like the curriculum. I just need support in this area. We want families to be able to say, we love our school, and that could mean private school, homeschool with an ESA, traditional homeschool, or a public district or charter school. We need more options, not less.
Why is it that Arizona has been such a trailblazer? You do have a number of other states that are following Arizona's lead on ESAs, but there's no getting around the fact that Arizona's been a leader on this front and also in general with the incredible expansion of the charter sector. It is quite unusual for a state of Arizona's size for over 100,000 students to be enlisted, to be enrolled, in charter schools. So tell us a little bit about that kind of Arizona difference. What is it that makes the state so open to this brand of experimentation?
I think it's very visionary leaders and lawmakers over the past 25 years that have essentially said, we've got a problem, which is we want our students to continue to improve in their reading and their math, and we need to look at innovative solutions. We can't keep accepting the status quo. You have leaders like Lisa Graham Keegan and others that really pushed for charter schools years and years ago in a bipartisan fashion. Now moving forward, we've got these empowerment scholarships that are universal. But over 10 years ago, there was an acknowledgement by a lot of conservative leaders, to be honest, in Arizona that said, we've got to do more for these kids. We're hearing too much from too many families that the traditional environment is just not working for their kids. what can we do and how can we help them? And that's where, those original ideas of ESA really came through with a lot of great leadership from think tanks and conservative leaders.
One thing I wonder about is when you're thinking about families, particularly middle-income families that were trying to homeschool, with those constrained resources, I wonder, your view is that the ESAs are having a supply-side response as well. There are new entrants, there are new entrepreneurs who are kind of getting in the mix. But I guess one concern that I've heard from a number of people, including a lot of folks in rural areas, is that this choice model might work in a big metro area. Maybe it's going to work in Phoenix. Maybe it's going to work in Tucson. But when you're thinking about rural Arizona, how are we going to unlock some of the benefits of this marketplace you're describing? Tell us about the dynamic in Arizona. Have you seen similar skepticism from rural areas? Or, has the advent of online learning meant that actually folks can really access new opportunity here?
I think there's always going to be skepticism as it relates to the rural question, right? Like, does this really work in rural communities? What we've really tried to do, both in Arizona and to help other states, is connect leaders and lawmakers and policy folks to examples of how it's actually working, whether that's schools or companies or parents that are saying this is working. I just loved a conversation I had last week with a mom who's looking to launch a micro school in Sholo, which is a very small town in Arizona. And essentially, she's a former public school teacher. She has a lot of kids that she tutors, and she knows that she could launch a 5-day-a-week micro school to really help these kids that she sees that are already struggling in a traditional environment. So is there going to be a little bit of an innovation lag? Probably. But what I've already seen happen in the last 6 months, it's catching up very quickly. People launching new choices. And what I will say is there's a lot of rural families that have been on ESA for years. But they just were in the former qualifying category. So one mom I love to talk about is a gal who has a child with special medical needs. And so they do have to come up to Phoenix and get specialized services and things like that. But they moved to a small town because they're a single income family and the husband's job moved. But they were able to start utilizing all of these different online tutoring options for their kiddo. So even though they were rural, they were still getting services from even occupational therapists through the computer because of an ESA. Now, those things can get very expensive, but again, the ESA actually made the transition to a rural environment easier for that family who had to move because of a job situation. So I think we're going to continue to see more options launch. I definitely don't buy the argument that it just doesn't work in rural communities because we're seeing it work. In fact, Love Your School is actually going to be highlighting and filming a family at the end of this week that lives right down near the southern border. And it's the same type of thing, a situation where the student was not doing well in a public school. The mom is a former public school teacher and basically said, I have to get on an ESA. Even though we're rural, my child needs the type of online classes offered through like OutSchool and other places in order to successfully graduate. And we could never cover that cost without an ESA.
There's an intense controversy about ESAs, what these programs mean, what they represent, and whether or not they are doing too much for more affluent families. When you look at the school choice movement, it's certainly a movement that has for a long time been bipartisan, is perhaps less bipartisan now than it had been in the past, but partly because when you looked at the bipartisan consensus of 10 or 20 years ago, there was this view that choice programs should be really focused on low-income households. It should be really focused on students who would otherwise be attending failing public schools. And as you were saying with the ESA program, it used to be more cabin in those ways. So I'm curious about your perspective on that. Do you believe that it's a valid concern that essentially you're going to be giving ESA money to households that would otherwise have been able to afford private school tuition, private tutoring, other enrichment programs? Or do you think that there is an affirmative case to be made for making this program as accessible as possible to make it universal?
These programs should be as accessible as possible. And I don't think that we should ever be limiting them based on a family's income, saying that this should only be allowed for low income families or middle income families for a variety of different reasons. One, we realize that education is a public good, meaning we don't maybe care all the different ways in which a child is educated. They can go to a charter school, they can go to a district school, but we want them to have an education. And states put money, they budget money for a child's education. So in the case of an ESA, we don't say, oh, your family's wealthy, you don't get access to public school. We're not going to we're not going to provide your child a free public education because your family makes X number of dollars. No, we allocate funds and we pay for that child's education, kindergarten through 12th grade, in a public school. So why would we not do exactly the same thing when it comes to these innovative ESA programs? And further, in Arizona's case, the ESA program actually saves taxpayers because it's only 90% of the state portion. So really what we're doing is we're saying we value education. We want all families to have access to education options. And in the process of doing this, what if we could actually save the state money when it comes to, our budget, when it comes to what we spend on education? So I believe that if you value education, if you see it as a necessary public good, that we should never say, well, some families should be able to qualify this, but if you've worked hard, if you've done well for yourself, if you have X number of dollars in your bank account, you get access to this option, but not that option.
Jenny, I suppose some folks would object and they'd say that, look, there are some affluent families that were quite happily to leave that public money on the table and pay out of pocket for private school. What you're saying, it seems, is that that's actually unfair. It may well be true that those families have the resources, but, simply put, it's not fair to them to expect them to surrender those public dollars that are meant to be educating their kids. Is that your perspective?
That's absolutely right. And the other thing I just kind of like to share on that too is we'll hear a lot of the argument of, well, this ESA amount, maybe it's not enough for this private school or that private school. But that's where we can talk about economies of scale. Maybe private schools that were smaller had to charge, a certain amount, let's say $10,000. And so we hear people say, well, the Arizona ESA is only $7,000. Who's going to bridge that gap? But when you're talking about economies of scale and more families having access and these schools potentially growing, a lot of schools I've talked to have already said, hey, when we get to this number of students, we're dropping our tuition $1,000. When we get to this number, we're going to drop it $2,000. And a lot of families that finally have access to ESAs who were just forced to pay out of pocket and usually at great expense. I know plenty of families that are middle income families that, the spouse worked a second job to be able to cover tuition for 2 to 3 children. They're able to now take some of those dollars and go, you know what? I want to give back to the private school. I want to help contribute to a scholarship to bridge that gap, if there even is one, so that more of these families that never had a chance can now have a chance and an opportunity. So the ESA has helped my family. I can turn around and help other families as well. And we're seeing that happen all over the valley.
That's fascinating. I also wonder, so the ESA as it stands represents 90% of what would have been state spending on that public school enrollee, but presumably there's also local spending as well. Have you seen any local governments raise their hands and say that, you know what, we're actually going to dedicate additional funds on top of the state ESA so that families in our local communities will have the local resources that would have otherwise gone to their public school?
We haven't seen that yet. That's something that we've definitely thought about. Right now, the local dollars still stay, at the public school. But I think there is a lot of opportunity to say, okay, if there is a gap and there is a school over here that all these families want to be a part of because they feel that their kids are going to get a superior education at this particular, say, private school option, what can we do as a community to help resource and fund families and bridge that gap? I hope to see that a lot more with private philanthropy and then also with local businesses, just really realizing what are the new kind of pop-up options, maybe in different career and technical fields that could pop up that are private and that local businesses could partner with, where we're utilizing the ESA and then we're getting private partnerships to be able to make it, completely affordable for families that are interested. And I'd love to see more of that.
You're in the public policy business, not the partisan politics business, but I am curious about your read as an Arizonan, as someone who's paying close attention to school choice debates around the country, about how universality changes the politics of school choice. Because, as we were discussing, there's this classic argument that if you make it narrower and more focused on lower income families, then maybe you can build a broader coalition because people think, well, in that case, it's appropriate. In that case, you have school districts that are in particularly bad shape. But another argument is that by making it universal, the constituency for school choice becomes much more expansive. There might be a lot of middle income and upper middle income families that wouldn't have been eligible before, but then who have skin in the game to support the program. I'm curious, how have you seen this shake out? What's your view about how the politics of choice might play out in the case of ESAs?
I think go big or go home. Universal is the way to go. Our program in Arizona for 10 years that had, over 10 different qualifying categories was extremely tiny. Even before universal, we estimated that about 250,000 kids probably qualified out of those categories, but yet the utilization, as I mentioned, was only around 12,000, and that was after 10 years. I think we've seen other states that have had very restricted programs. Really,
is that because it's intimidating? Because the kind of various, the kind of obstacles in your way, the kind of evaluation qualification system just seemed
all of that. It's all of that. And you really have to think about it from even like a business perspective too, where if you have a program with really low utilization, are you going to see new businesses and providers and schools launch with a very small number of people utilizing a program? It's the same reason why, if a state's going to say, we're going to allow charters, but we're only going to allow 2 operators. Well, who's going to want to go launch into that state if they feel like there's going to be restrictions on their growth? So I think it was kind of the chicken and the egg type of situation.
Fascinating.
But also you didn't tend to know a lot of other families that had gone through the process that were utilizing it. And I just even remember, pre-universal, I would have to spend a lot of time talking to therapists and tutors and vendors, explaining ESA to them, walking them through the process, helping them understand how I was going to pay them. And some of them would still say, this is weird, this is confusing, I don't get it. Just, pay me like you'd normally pay me. So there was a huge burden even on the families to be educating potential providers so that they would accept our ESA funds. And when you go universal, everybody knows about it. There's high utilization. There's quick, flexible use of the spending and the dollars. And the thing that I love to talk about also is the very bipartisan nature of the families that end up utilizing the program. While there might be certain sets of lawmakers that are the ones that get behind these programs and really push them, the people that are actually benefiting from the program, at least in Arizona, are all across the board, from left, center to right. In fact, it's been very fascinating to me in the relationships that I've built with so many of these families that basically say, my voting litmus test issue used to be this, because this is where I'm at party-wise. We've even had some folks say this on camera in Love Your School videos. But now, because what I've seen the ESA do for my family, what it's unlocked, my litmus test issue is this. It's school choice. It's ESA. And that's incredibly powerful, knowing that the families that are utilizing the program are all across the political spectrum.
My understanding is that the opening up of the Arizona ESA, the decision to make it universal, that is quite new. And therefore, you had this kind of funny political tussle over when to open up the program for applications. And that this past year, applications opened up after the public school academic year actually began. So I'm curious, when you're looking to the next academic year, do you expect to see very significant growth beyond the growth we've already seen in the program?
I expect to see extremely significant growth. And what you mentioned is exactly kind of what happened. The law passed, it was signed, and then essentially one of the anti-school choice groups in Arizona, Save Our Schools Arizona, said, we don't like this, we want to stop it. We want to try to refer this law that was passed and signed by the governor to the ballot. And they had 90 days in order to gather enough signatures in order to refer it to the ballot. Well, of course, we all know that they failed quite significantly. They ended up being about 50,000 signatures short of what they needed to qualify, which was not the case in 2018 when they were able to successfully refer it to the ballot. So a pretty big shift in Arizona, even among families and voters in just a 4-year period of time. But the result of them trying to refer it meant that the law didn't go into effect when when it was supposed to, because we were waiting to see, right, if those signatures came about. And that happened to be mid-September. So a lot of families said, we can't gamble with going through this process. We don't know if we can switch to a private school, because what if it is referred? Then we won't know if it goes into effect until after the election in November. And a lot of families chose to kind of wait it out, stay in their current public school environment, and then transition next year if there's interest. So right now, actually, applications opened yesterday on April 17th.
Wow.
For the next school year. Applications are open year round, but for the next school year, you can now start to apply. So from now through July, it's going to be a very exciting time to see how many new families are applying for an ESA and are what we call switchers from the public school system.
Have you seen any estimates for what that growth might look like? Because if we're at 50,000 or so now, is the expectation that it goes to 60, 70, or do you see a doubling? I mean, what are we talking about here?
Oh, it's very difficult. We haven't really seen too many estimates. The Joint Legislative Budget Committee did try to come up with an estimate attached to the fiscal note on the universal ESA bill that was passed in 2022, because they were trying to give, some budget projections about what the program growth would look like. Of course, it's just dependent on so many factors. It's dependent on new school options. It's dependent on marketing and other nonprofits like Love Your School getting the word out and supporting families. It's dependent also on what's happening in the public schools. What additions, what changes, what new programs are they willing to offer to keep students enrolled?
And that's part of the objective here, too, of choice, right? You want to get the incumbent district public schools to up their game. And if they do that, then that actually is a mark of success rather than failure.
That's exactly right. And just like when we had charter schools pass, 25 years ago, a lot of schools said, okay, we see that families are leaving because they want to go to this fantastic charter school over here that's launching. How can we offer similar programming and resources right here in our district option and launch magnet or district options inside of our public school system? And that's what we hope for, right? Like, we're not trying to draw families one way or another. What we do want is more choices, more options, because we want our kids learning to read. We want them having a joy for learning. We want them to know how to do math. We want them to be successful graduates that are either going a career route or going on to the university. And we know right now that the status quo system is just not working.
One thing that's interesting and surprising is that you have a number of successful pushes for universal school choice, but you also have some places, some conservative states where these efforts have been stymied. Wyoming, for example, is a state where 57 of the 62 state representatives are Republicans, most of whom would describe themselves as pretty conservative. Yet in February, the Wyoming Freedom Scholarship Act was shelved after facing immense pushback. I'm curious, I know that you're grounded in Arizona. That's the environment you know best, where you've been, pursuing your activism. But when you're thinking about a state like Wyoming and other states like it, what do you think are the main misgivings? And if you were advising an activist on the ground there to help build that case for ESAs, how would you do it?
Focus on the student, focus on the child, focus on what we know and the data that we have about how our kids are doing. And from a public school environment, if you are the superintendent of a public school system, or you're a legislator and you have a great relationship with your local public school district, and they're doing a wonderful and a fantastic job, they don't need to worry about a school choice program like an ESA, because they're not going to switch. Families are not going to switch. They love what's happening there. But we have to think about all of those students who, for whatever reason, for so many reasons, that environment isn't working. Even in Arizona, we ran into an issue constantly where we had students that have significant depression, emotional disabilities, other type of health impairments that basically meant the traditional environment wasn't working for them, but they did not have an IEP. We could not get them onto the ESA program back then, but the traditional environment wasn't working either, so they were falling through the cracks. That happens a lot with kids that are bullied for a variety of different reasons. What choices and options do they have? So we really have to think about students and the broad spectrum of students and what they need, especially students nowadays, I mean, I mentioned this before, but 1 in 36 kids has autism now. That's the diagnosis rate. I just heard about it last week. And we don't always catch that, but we might see that a traditional environment isn't working for a kiddo. So we need to give everybody a choice because we don't know what's going to happen in their life, in their education. And we shouldn't be worried about the traditional system crumbling just because we're offering a choice program for those kids who need it.
There's another closely related concern argument that you'll hear from folks who are skeptical about ESAs, which is that, as you were suggesting, a lot of people see schools as a source of community-specific social capital. In an America where folks feel like they're isolated, their communities are really fragmented, they don't have a lot of opportunities to rub shoulders with other people, there is this concern that public education is a bedrock of civic life, and that when you want to inculcate an ethic of citizenship in the next generation, that's really, really important. What do you say about that? And how is it that, you as a homeschooling parent yourself and someone who knows a lot of others too, how is it that, you and folks in your community think about the kind of civic education piece and making sure that, kind of people are not isolating themselves from the wider community and its needs and its sensibilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a few different things. First of all, I think there's several articles that even came out last week talking about civics education and what kids are actually kind of learning in the classroom. Are they learning to love their country? Are they learning to love America and the things that we want them to do as it relates to civic education? And so I think a lot of that is an idea that's probably not actually happening on the ground anymore. And I look forward to continued, research and reporting kind of in that area. But I would actually argue that when you're providing these alternative options, you're creating more opportunities for that to happen. You're creating a broader menu of ways that kids can get connected and get involved in their community by just sheer flexibility of programming. I think about all the time kids that are bound by their district because of their zip code and where they live. And that can be a good thing or it can be a very bad thing when we come to certain, communities, even in Arizona. And of course, this is an issue nationally. But when you think about the opportunity to give everybody their education dollars back, now all of a sudden you have a child that never had the opportunity to go to a school 10 miles away in a very different culture and community, and arguably potentially the opportunity to have more civic engagement with kids that are very different than their family, their socioeconomic status, or a variety of different factors, ethnic group, you name it, religious group. And that's pretty amazing. And I'll never forget this story of a family. I've shared it many times that we went to their home, a refugee family that had been in the States for several years, to sign them up on an ESA. And we needed to do that in person during COVID. And they wanted to leave the public school environment because their non-speaking child was being asked to log onto Zoom to participate in coursework to stay enrolled, which of course did not work. And after we got the family on ESA, they got a significantly high ESA award amount that they were going to use for in-home tutors and education and therapies. They said after COVID, they really wanted to enroll their child into a public school. And this happened to be a very devout Muslim family. And I said, okay, do you want to enroll them in, the Muslim school that actually happens to your daughter in the Muslim school that happens to be in this area? And she said, no. She said she actually wanted them to be in this fantastic Catholic school that she knew about and that she had friends in because she liked how they treated the children. And that was really an eye-opener for me, just thinking about we have assumptions about where kids are going to get the best civic education, where they're going to rub shoulders and learn about, what it means to be human and connect with people that are different from them and value and appreciate people from different backgrounds on a variety of different levels. And we think, well, that can only happen in the public school environment. But when you give parents a choice, it is absolutely remarkable and exciting and shocking what they may actually choose for their children. And it's a reason why I'm such a strong advocate for these programs.
One issue that I find interesting, and I'm not sure how exactly this would shake out in Arizona, but is that you often have families, particularly middle-class families, that become very anxious about schools in lower income, in stressed urban communities. And it seems as though ESAs are actually a tool to help keep those families in neighborhoods that they might love, but where they might be dissatisfied with the schools. I'm curious if that's something you've seen, where there are families that might have moved out to the suburbs but are deciding to stay in a downtown urban community because now they have this new tool that's making it possible for them to do that while loving their school.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about that, for myself, where I'm at. Remember, I shared that the local school district did not have any programs to help my children with dyslexia. And so the thought, back in the day, pre-universal ESA or even pre-open enrollment would probably have been, okay, where is the school that's going to do the best job helping my child with this issue, and how are we going to go move there, afford that, rearrange our whole lives around this thing that's so important to us, which is our
And
child.
and take you out of a community you might love,
Yes.
neighbors you
Yeah,
might
with
love and
neighbors,
appreciate.
so many different things, so many different things. And now we're not having to do that. I think another neat story, if I can, is just a mom I talked to who does live in South Phoenix, who said that, she wishes she could see more of her son because she has to work at a, beautiful resort in Scottsdale. And because it's such a long drive, she has to put her child into a before school program and an after school program very early in her community. But with an ESA, I said, well, what if you could actually put your child in a private school, and near where you work, you're going to get all that extra time in the morning and the evening with your kiddo, but you're still going to live in an area where it is your cultural and ethnic community that you want to stay in. So you're getting the best of both worlds, right? That's what an ESA does.
I'm curious if you believe that COVID and the COVID school closures has influenced this debate around ESAs and school choice writ large. It certainly seems as though in some states, in some school districts, you had school closures that were very prolonged, in which there were a lot of families that felt alienated from their local district schools. I'm curious, do you think that played a role here at all in kind of changing the conversation?
It absolutely played a role and changed the conversation. When we launched Love Your School as a nonprofit, it was in January of 2020. And then in March, of course, everything shut down. And I thought, oh my gosh, nobody's going to need our help, our support, finding options, like what's happening. And it was the complete opposite. We could not keep up with the demand of families that were basically saying, what do I do? This isn't working out. What are my rights? I need other choices. And even then, we were getting as many families that qualified under the old guidelines onto an ESA. And I have a Twitter thread that went kind of, popular for a while. And it was a series of kind of 10 tweets. And it was pictures of my own children and all the things that we were able to do during COVID with our kids, because I already had an ESA. All the online classes we were able to sign up for, all of the educational delivery boxes, books, everything. And parents were, simultaneously like, wow, that's amazing. And then angry because they're like, that gal got to continue her child's education and do it with state funding. And meanwhile, I was stuck with whatever the public school provided, and my kiddo got really behind. So it absolutely heightened this entire, conversation, especially for districts that chose to stay closed longer.
I wonder, when you're thinking about the ESA program, and here I know this is speculative, but I'm just kind of curious to hear your personal thoughts on this. Let's say the ESA program manages to survive the intense political opposition it's almost sure to face, and 10 years from now, what do you think education in Arizona is going to look like? How will families relate to their schools and their educational options? And do you think that the proliferation of choice is going to have a meaningful effect on educational performance? Or do you think that that's not necessarily the right metric?
I don't think necessarily it's the right metric. However, I do think that we, as a result of choice, will see scores go up. I mean, we know that that's the case for choice programs in other states. I've just learned, even myself, like with my own children, how a lot of the standardized testing, while very valuable in a lot of different, ways and different regards, especially when you're trying to meet benchmarks for kids that do have learning disabilities, there can be a lot of value in them. But my mind has completely been just opened and blown being on an ESA with my own kids and realizing, wow, I used to think a good education, a smart child that was going to be graduating and be successful looked like this, and this, right? They were doing algebra by this grade. They were, writing, paragraphs and being critical thinkers by this grade. They were doing all of these things. But now that our own family has access to just incredible choices, online programs, tutoring. I mean, they go to woodworking school. They do, an online synthesis engineering type class. They do all of these things. It's almost going to be impossible to measure, except for I think that in Arizona, at least, we're going to see test scores probably go up for those that stay in the traditional environments. We know that's true. I think that we're going to see a far more highly skilled and trained workforce ready to jump into jobs after graduation at 18. I think we'll start to see more highly trained students that are being successful in graduating from four-year universities. And I can't wait to see the research on that, voluntarily or otherwise, to show what 10 years of a universal ESA has done for students, for the economy, for our state. I feel extremely positive and hopeful about it.
A few other random thoughts, if you'll forgive me. One, there has been a recent controversy about teenagers getting back in the workforce. The idea that having a part-time job, something that many of us did when we were growing up, is something that is a good and healthy and constructive thing, yet it's something that's certainly become a lot less common. Can you envision some homeschooling families, some ESA families finding ways for their teenagers to engage in the world of work? And do you think of that as mostly a positive thing?
Oh, absolutely. And yes, it's incredibly positive. And I will just share a personal family story as it relates to that. When you get a diagnosis for your kid, and even something people might say, oh, it's just dyslexia. No, it was, very earth shattering for our family. I remember thinking, will my child ever love to read chapter books? Will he ever be able to write a 10-page paper? Well, now we're, 5 years into that diagnosis. And I don't think my oldest son would be as incredibly successful as he is without the ESA. But now we've got a lot of extra time as we've learned how to cultivate his education. He accomplishes things very quickly. I mentioned that we're pooling our ESA dollars next year with another family to hire a private teacher for 5 boys, 3 of whom have unique and special needs. And we get curriculum done very quickly in the day. So the natural result of that is my 13-year-old is already going, when I turn 14, with your permission and your signature on the Arizona paperwork, I'm going to go get a job, down the street, because the gal already said she likes me, she wants to hire me, and I'm going to have time in the day to do it. He's already talking about that. I actually just tweeted about it 2 days ago. It happens to be a Chick-fil-A, and she happened to say, your son's amazing, we want him hired here. And he's 14. So it's absolutely going to provide more time and more opportunity for students to engage in the workforce, and even for them,
and help them develop responsibility and help them develop a work ethic and experiments. Yeah,
all of that. I mentioned also they go to Phoenix Woodworking School, so they've been there for over 2 years. So the skills that they're learning at a very young age could enable them to do some really incredible jobs at 15 and 16 years old, and want to engage in the workforce because of the ESA.
Wow. And also just, if they do decide to enroll in college, they're going to come to that with much more maturity and a sense of responsibility. That's really amazing. One other frontier when you're looking at debates over school choice is this idea of course level instructional choice. That is the idea that, yes, going to a charter school versus a public district school, or getting an ESA. But another possibility could be I go to my local district school, let's say, but I can choose different modules. Do I want to do health education somewhere else, physical education? Do I want to take Mandarin online rather than take French, from the teacher who happens to be provided by the district? What do you think about that idea? Do you think that's something that might gain traction in the years to come to help kind of open up the public district schools themselves?
Yes, absolutely. Parents are already trying to do that here in Arizona. We've got some districts that are very open to that. I should say some charters that are very open to that are going, okay, how can we provide a la carte options? How do we charge? What does that look like? How do we build that from the state? Because we want these kids to be able to take, an advanced chemistry class here. We want them to be able to participate in band, but we would have to charge them if they're an ESA student. So how do we do that? And then we're starting to see some districts, I had my eyes on a letter 2 weeks ago, that are saying, oh, we can't even do that for you.
Because it's too complex, it's too administratively involved.
Exactly. It was an administrative thing, right? They literally said, we don't know how we would code your child in our system in order to do that, right? But those are problems just looking for a solution. They can be solved. I do think that we will see more of that, especially because you would never have gotten that student on their own, as a public school, right? Because the parent, for whatever reason, was like, I don't want to enroll my child here. I'm doing something else. So why not be smart and be innovative and capture some dollars from that student? Even, building out a program that benefits, the public schools kids that are fully enrolled, but you also have 5, 10, 50 ESA kids coming in, and they're paying for that class.
Yes.
So it's enabling you to do something really unique on your
You already have this infrastructure, let's say. Yes. You already have this resource. Why not allow other students to use it? That's fascinating.
Absolutely.
So Love Your School has focused very much on your home state of Arizona. Obviously Arizona has been such a trailblazer. There's a lot of logic to that. But I understand you have ambitions to export the model and deliver advice to parents across the country. Can you tell us a bit about what Love Your School is doing to kind of scale up its model and its efforts?
Absolutely. So we kind of had a scaling up, if you will, in West Virginia last year when they passed, of course, the absolutely fantastic Hope Scholarship. And really what we wanted to do there is work alongside other policy organizations, grassroots organizations on the ground, essentially helping bridge the imagination gap, helping to say, hey, this is what we've done in Arizona. This is what's great. This is what worked. This is what didn't work, and build that relationship and connection so that they could start to dream and start to implement and have the things that Arizona families have had for years. We want to continue to do that in states that are passing these amazing ESA programs. We don't want you to have to wait 10 years to get to the place that we are now. And if we can do that by connecting vendors and service providers, supporting parents, providing on-the-ground resources for implementation, that's really our desire, is to help other states grow better and faster when it comes to their ESA programs.
That does seem so important because given the ferocity of the political debates, it does seem as though you have a lot of people who are looking for failures. They're looking for outlier cases. They're looking for instances where you have home education not being a good fit or worse. So it really does seem as though finding people, vetting new institutions, new providers is a really, really important part of the mix.
Yes, absolutely. It's the high quality provider option, right? We talked a little bit about that before. If we can help build the environment of high quality schools, micro schools, education service providers, we of course want to participate in that.
Your group certainly is really important and influential as an advocacy group in Arizona and elsewhere, but you're also an organization that, as you described earlier, is working directly with families, helping bring them together, helping get them the best information they can get in order to become successful home educators and much else. Successful choosers in this kind of growing and complex marketplace of options. I'm curious, how is it that you've surfaced folks to help? Because, social media is a great tool, a great way to get the message out, but, it's not necessarily your ordinary moms and dads who are going to be, on social media all day and all night. So I'm curious, how have people come to you? How have they discovered you?
A lot of it, the majority of it, and we actually do track this, in our CRM, is referrals. So essentially, we spend almost no money on marketing or anything like that. We will serve and support a family, and they will be very grateful and happy with the service. And then they go and they refer us, or they talk to their school about us, or their community group, or something else that they're involved in. And then we end up helping other families, and we also end up speaking at a lot of different events, but it's almost primarily through referrals. And then Love Your School, as far as our growth and our team, I think pretty much everybody that's on our team are families that we've either serviced or that we've connected to at some point in this process. And they were moms who were very knowledgeable, who were excited, who wanted to take it to the next level. And we love hiring moms on a contract basis so they can continue to do their other job or be at home with their kids or whatever it is. But they're really knowledgeable about a variety of topics, and give them the opportunity to be a part of Love Your School, to be a part of our team, and to service other families. That's really how we've, surfaced so many of the families that we end up supporting. We are very active on social media. We do have a very large ESA Facebook group. We just hit 3,100 members. And even within that group, we scan that, we see who's answering questions, who's very diligent. And we've, promoted, for lack of a better word in Facebook terms, several parent leaders to be group experts. And they get in there, they answer questions, they give guidance, and there's just a kind of 24 hours a day place where parents can get solutions and answers in addition to all the other ways that we serve families. So it's been very organic, but it's also been making sure that we're providing opportunities for parents to advance and be a part of our network, and giving them opportunities to also use their gifts and their skills.
I wonder, this program is incredible. You've championed a lot of really great and important reforms, and it does seem as though these reforms do have momentum in a number of states, but there are some states that are nowhere near adopting a universal ESA program. And I wonder, for you as a home educator, as a parent, as an active and engaged citizen, if you were going to advise a parent in one of these other states where, you're nowhere close to having this kind of public policy revolution, what would you say to a parent who's thinking about starting a micro school or thinking about going the homeschooling route? Is there any advice you might have for them with the assumption that public policy is not going to be there to help you?
Yes, absolutely. So my first bit of advice is always just go for it. Just do it, because you might feel like you are alone, that you're in a vacuum and you're the only one in your community or your state or whatever that's thinking this way. But chances are you're not. And if you start something and you start also talking about it, you will probably be very surprised how many and how quickly just you having conversations with other parents can grow into something big, like an advocacy organization, like your own nonprofit. I mean, I never in a million years thought that I would be leading, like a nonprofit. Like, I don't know the first thing about these things, but it was just through conversations with other parents and other folks who shared a same desire, but also concern and dissatisfaction with the status quo. And you start to band together, and lo and behold, in Arizona now, 4 years later, we have a universal ESA. So you never know what can happen in your state.
I am so grateful to you. This really was so fascinating. I'm so impressed by Love Your School, and I particularly appreciated what you had to say at the end. Jenny Clark, thank you very much for your work, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.